Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Slow Your Roll. I'm Cody.
And I'm Alex.
And today we are going to be dissecting exactly what a good, chaotic aligned character would look like in whatever TTRPG it is that you're playing. So to start this thing off, when approaching characters in general that are aligned with some sort of chaotic alignment or on that spectrum, chaotic good, neutral, or evil, it's common for a lot of players to intentionally gravitate toward that character being the way that they are because of past traumas or mental illnesses or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's maybe the most common way to make a chaotic character, and it just makes sense. But you don't have to have the trauma or mental illness or whatever. That is not required to make a good chaotic character. There are good ways to go about making a character without those traumas or whatever else, such as a person could have just a lot of value for individual freedom over social order, or they might just relish in spontaneity and personal expression as a matter of principle or personality. Or a really classic one, especially for NPCs even, is you could have a character with ideological stances that naturally place them at odds with some established order of things that are happening.
So with all that being said, what are some things to consider when building a chaotic character? How can you make one without having to rely on a trauma or some sort of schizophrenic psychosis to take over? Well, I might think of a cultural background. Perhaps they come from a society that encourages independence, maybe a little bit of trickster behavior or social fluidity. Try to think of barbarian culture. A barbarian tribe trying to be assimilated into civilized society. There's going to be a massive culture shock for the barbarians, or someone from a civilized society being thrust into barbarian culture. You could imagine might makes right in one of those cultures, and it's probably not the one with cars. Another thing that you could think of for chaotic nature would be a moral philosophy that is kind of held above any other. Like a worldview that places personal freedom above the particular rules of the land. And truthfully, you could just be that quirky in comparison. Your personality could actually be chaotic in nature. You could have some sort of curious or easily bored type of easily irritated nature that kind of helps your character lend to that chaotic nature. And the easiest way to characterize somebody as a chaotic aligned person would probably be an aversion to the rules of law and order. Usually an ethical objection to whatever the rule of law is. And one of the most compelling reasons to make a chaotic character is their ethical objections to authority. They might see laws and certain institutions as corrupt, preferring their own personal moral code for guidance, even if that's just for excitement or unpredictability. And to further illustrate what those ethical objections might look like, let's go straight into a chaotic good example. Try to think of the benevolent highwayman. Somebody who's only taxing the rich high levels and more or less giving the poor free or less taxes. Or somebody who's giving the poor less taxes or outright free. Your Robin Hood type of character who's going to be doing his best to get back at the people he finds abhorrent. But truthfully, if you were going to break it down, what it means to be a chaotic good character, you want to do what's right, but they don't feel beholden to laws or traditions if those end up standing in the way. They believe that true virtue really only comes from acting outside of social constraints. That doesn't mean that they're anarchists looking to destroy order. Rather, they simply won't let laws prevent them from doing good.
If you were to look at a character closer to the chaotic neutral spectrum, and really a lot of these would kind of blend together depending on your actions, don't feel like you have to be stuck in a specific alignment or anything like that. I mean, most people, plainly don't really care too much about alignment, even playing D&D nowadays. But going further to the neutral side of chaotic, a good example for this would be like a trickster fae bard or something like that. This character might be a traveling performer with an innate love for spontaneity. They come from a culture or a species such as the Fae, for example, that treats rules as really just curious human inventions rather than actual truths. There's no secret trauma lurking in their past necessarily. They've simply never felt the need to honor social contracts that seem arbitrary to them. Their real motivation for doing what they do They just find the world at its most vibrant when it's unpredictable, and everything else is kind of just boring. They'll follow a whim right off a cliff if that's what it takes to lead to enlightenment for them. They're not necessarily malicious, despite what a lot of people might think running a chaotic character might look like, but they're not necessarily that particularly kind either. They operate entirely by personal fancy and just prizing freedom and novelty above everything else.
Now we've gotten to the cream of the crop, the black sheep, the one that gets the most PR and probably gets blamed for everything chaotic. Chaotic evil. A lot of times you're not going to have a chaotic evil character. More or less it's going to be a villain in your campaign that's chaotic evil. It would be incredibly hard to play one of these characters, but I'm not going to say it's impossible. You just got to have the right DM and the right type of evil people around you. But when it does come to something like that, a chaotic evil person doesn't necessarily do things for a rhyme or reason. They're doing evil for evil's sake. They would burn down a village just for kicks. Try to think of people like the Joker or maybe Bellatrix Lestrange from Harry Potter. These are the type of people who you're probably going to see riddled with mental illness or trauma. It doesn't necessarily have to be this way, but I would be hard pressed to find a story that features a chaotic evil character that doesn't have mountains of trauma behind them.
So to much more quickly summarize that, chaotic good characters, they're going to be using their independence to do what they believe is right, even if it breaks the rules a little bit. Whereas the chaotic neutral might just serve themselves and their personal freedom, neither compelled to help nor harm anyone specifically. And then the chaotic evil characters, basically they're just going to revel in their lawlessness to dominate, hurt, and destroy with no concern for anyone or for morality as a whole. And though it would be hard to play a chaotic evil character like Alex said, it's maybe not impossible. These are the pitfalls you want to watch out for. Number one, confusing chaotic with random or just silly. Chaotic doesn't necessarily mean that you're making every decision based on whatever dice you roll. It doesn't mean that you have to ignore the plot or behave nonsensically. In fact, all it should mean really is that your character values personal freedom, mistrusts authority, or follows their own moral code over anything else.
And with that definition, I bet you're realizing you guys have played a chaotic character too.
Yeah. In fact, I think a lot of people have brought their role playing into chaotic alignments without really even thinking or caring that much. Like, oh, you killed that merchant, but at the same time it saved that person, so oh well. And you just kind of move on and make jokes about it, but I mean, that's really all chaotic characters are.
Exactly.
But the second thing you definitely want to avoid is becoming a lone wolf at the party's expense. And this is really this piece of advice can fall into any character you make ever, including making the hard lone wolf type person like a witcher or something. But yeah, your character might have a strong independent streak, and that's okay. But remember, D&D or really any other TTRPG that I've played, they are all cooperative games. And the second that you intentionally build a character that breaks that mechanic of the game, everyone at the table is going to be having a lot less fun in a hurry if you're not careful.
Yeah, lone wolves are really hard to pull off, but here's the thing. A lone wolf usually has to have a reason why they're with a group, and that reason is pretty compelling to stick with them. The Witchers are never alone for too long.
Exactly.
And another thing that we're going to have to say is constantly undermining the campaign or narrative isn't necessarily chaotic. Your DM and fellow players are really going to appreciate your character working within the narrative, especially if that's in a weird and obscure type of way. For instance, if the campaign centers around toppling a noble and infiltrating his castle, your character could probably do that in some pretty unorthodox ways, like the rogue jester, going in, throwing a bunch of caltrops or marbles all over the ground just to cause chaos, putting powder on the floor to make footprints lead to nowhere. Just simple little things that would essentially put the guards out of commission, but in your own special way. And there is a little something that we should probably try to move away from when it comes from chaotic, because chaotic is not necessarily a synonym for evil. A chaotic good person could be like a heroic rebel who frees these people from the barbarians. Chaotic neutral could be Romeo and Juliet absconding away together as lovers, not caring about their family or tradition. And chaotic evil can be pretty tricky to approach. They should have some sort of internal logic from which they govern themselves. So it's not just some random act of cruelty, there's actual reasons and motivations behind them. And by avoiding some of those pitfalls, you can finally fit them in to your next campaign.
And speaking of your next game, it is important to be able to actually fit your character into said game without it feeling weird. So some of the best ways to do that is really just to build a backstory that justifies exactly why you're such a freedom-loving character or whatever. Again, it can include a bunch of traumas and mental illness and issues or whatever else. In fact, it's a bit of a trope for D&D characters or whatever to have those things, so go for it. You can. It's an easy way to achieve a chaotic character for actual reasons. But again, you don't have to, given our examples. Either way, just build a backstory that makes sense and justifies why your character is the way they are. One of the first things you want to do, really, through role-playing or whatever else, maybe even talk to some of the other players that are making characters, maybe during session 0 or whatever, but you want to find common ground with the party goals one way or another. It's one of the first things you should do. Just strongly go out of your way to establish a personal stake in the party's mission. And of course, before you really get started with any of this, like I said, talking to other players, also talk to your DM and your party. Make sure that your DM or GM knows that you actually want to play a chaotic character. Describe to them how it would look generally so they're not just scared or say no, and you guys can figure it out together.
You could totally fit a chaotic character into essentially any setting, but there's obviously a story or two that might lend itself a little bit more to that chaotic type of nature. So if you are going to do a revolutionary campaign where we're overthrowing the kingdom, castle, or government, you're gonna fit right in. There's also a pretty good argument for some sort of frontier exploration campaign, where you're literally going through uncharted territory and mapping things out. There's so much room for interaction with a chaotic character when there's no laws to break. And the last one is a classic. There's going to be so many of these stories from pretty much anyone who sells D&D stories. The heist. You could probably look at D&D itself for 3 or 4 different types of heist books. And if you've ever seen any of the Ocean's movie, you know for a fact exactly how chaotic it can get. And for anyone who's trying to come up with, let's say, a chaotic type of character and you haven't really got the inspiration that you were looking for, try to think of somebody like a benevolent outlaw. Somebody who really just steals from the rich or a certain type of people and gives to his own people or the poor. Your classic Robin Hood. I can totally think of a bunch of druids that probably think civilized society is pretty backwards. They would probably end up just flaunting city laws because they find them arbitrary in the first place, and they're beholden to Mother Nature. I could probably think of so many different kinds of archetypes that you could model your character after, but if you've got a good one, please leave the third one down in the comments.
There are definitely several classes. I mean, speaking of archetypes, there's plenty of classes that would lend themselves super well to just playing chaotic characters, even just naturally or by default. And I'm going to start you with one kind of ironic here. You can chime in if you want, Alex, but I think a paladin could actually make a really good chaotic good character. Like, all you have to do is believe really strongly in something specifically and act really passionately and almost rashly on it. I mean, that's just a overhyped paladin, really.
I could totally see it. And okay, this is low-hanging fruit here, but Bard.
Oh yeah.
They're almost inherently chaotic, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely, 100%. And I guess cheating, like taking the opposite route of the paladin as a warlock, kind of. Like, they're still serving someone specifically or ideals specifically, but it's even easier to put them on the chaotic spectrum, probably.
True. It's pretty hard to, I don't know, man. It's pretty hard to call yourself like, no, I'm good, I'm lawful, and then your eyes turn black and you hear the You're
just blasting eldritch horrors out of your arms. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, that's Jeff. He's a good guy.
Yeah, you really got to get to know him. He's a good dude. And then, of course, you've got like barbarians. Obviously, rage makes it super easy to be chaotic.
Oh, totally. And a rogue, thieves guild type of stuff. That's just so easy.
Yeah, that's very chaotic neutral too, of course. Like, you just take what you want for your sake.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So just remember, when you're making your next chaotic-inspired character, a great chaotic character isn't an impediment to the party, or the game as a whole, or the DM, or anyone. but rather a really interesting and hopefully likable source of creative tension and like unique solutions of just solving things kind of wildly. To do it right, just keep your character driven with a specific goal, specific things that make them chaotic, without intentionally going against the plans of others, unless it's really cool and makes sense. I mean, sometimes it might work, but not always. That way, instead of derailing a campaign as a whole, you'll be adding a fresh dimension that everyone can enjoy. But that's pretty much all we got for you, so thank you guys so much for sticking around and watching. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. Let us know if there's something we're definitely missing, or if you have stories of when this went just terribly wrong the last time you tried to make a chaotic character. But yeah, thank you guys, and we will see you later.
Have a good one, everybody.